which allows curators to delve more deeply into the areas of the collection they look after, and is part of our celebration of the centennial year here at the Legion of Honor. So please, please do come back on the second Saturday of each month to hear from different members of our curatorial staff about some of the objects they love best and that belong to all San Franciscans. Before we get started, I'll share our institutional land acknowledgement. The Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco occupy unceded land of the Ramaytush Ohlone, who are the original inhabitants of what is now the San Francisco Peninsula. The Greater Bay Area is also the ancestral territory of other Ohlone peoples, as well as the Miwok, Yakuts, and Patwin. We acknowledge, recognize, and honor the indigenous ancestors, elders, and descendants whose nations and communities have lived in the Bay Area over many generations and continue to do so today. We respect the enduring relationships that exist between indigenous peoples and their homelands. We are committed to partnering with indigenous communities to raise awareness of their legacy and engage with the history of the region, the impacts of genocide, and the dynamics of settler colonialism that persist. Lincoln Park, where the Legion of Honor was founded in 1924, operated as city cemetery from 1868 until 1898, when the park was created. Many of the burials were relocated, but the majority were not. Please join the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco in honoring the memory of the thousands of individuals still buried in this land. So, David Oakey, our brand new curator in charge of European decorative arts and sculpture here at the Fine Arts Museums, is an internationally recognized specialist in European decorative arts with particular expertise in French and British furniture and porcelain of the late 18th century. He began his career at the Royal Collection Trust, where his various projects included the Queen's Year, an exhibition presented at Buckingham Palace in 2010. He subsequently served as Director of Research for Carlton Hobbs, a leading decorative arts dealer in New York, and then for a decade as a curator of one of the world's most prestigious private collections, especially rich in 18th century French furniture. David has published and lectured widely in the field. His articles have appeared in the journals of the Furniture History Society and the English Ceramic Circle, and his book contributions include an essay on the Lost Palace Carlton House for the 2019 Royal Collection Catalog, George IV, Art and Spectacle, as well as a chapter in Bloomsbury's Cultural History of Furniture, published in 2021. David has lectured before the Society of Court Studies, the Furniture History Society, the English Ceramics Circle, the London Ceramics Circle, and the Addingham Trust, and has given talks at the Wallace Collection, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Victoria and Albert Museum, among other institutions. He holds a master's degree in decorative arts and historic interiors from the University of Buckingham and is a doctoral candidate at the University of Cambridge. In 2022, he was named a Fellow of the Society of Antiquaries of London. And since joining us here in San Francisco, little over a month ago, he has plunged headlong into our permanent collection, making all sorts of exciting discoveries and observations, some of which we'll get to hear about today. It's my delight to welcome David Oakey to the podium.
Thank you, Emily, for that very kind introduction. And thank you for inviting me to speak as part of this wonderful lecture series celebrating the centennial of the Legion of Honor. I'd like to extend my gratitude to Rocio Garcia, Devin Malone, Rosario Sotelo, and Maria Agarville on our programming team, and to our AV specialists today, Aidan Correa, Michael Gold, and Robert Sell. And a heartfelt thank you to my colleagues here at the Fine Arts Museums, as well as to the many donors, supporters, and friends who have made me feel so welcome over the past month or so, especially those involved with the European Decorative Arts Council, the San Francisco Ceramics Circle, the Golden Gate Collectors, and our wonderful docents. It's truly inspiring to see such engaged and enthusiastic communities centered around our department here at the Legion. And I'd like to say a special thank you to my predecessor, Martin Chapman, for his kind welcome and for generously sharing his considerable expertise and experience with me. Well, what an honor it is to be speaking to you today as the new curator in charge of European decorative arts and sculpture here at this great museum. As Emily mentioned, at 10 weeks in, I'm still very new in the role, but I'm going to turn that fresh perspective to my advantage and take a closer look at a few objects that have already captured my interest at this early stage, and which I'm most excited about exploring in depth over the coming years. I'll be looking at these in the order that they were acquired or donated, which might also, I hope, show us something about how the collection has evolved over time. Of course, making this selection has been no easy task. This is one of the finest and most significant collections of its kind in the United States. I have over 7,000 objects to choose from, brimming with treasures including furniture, ceramics, sculpture, silver, gold boxes, and objets d'art that span centuries, cultures, and styles alike. So, I've had to narrow my focus somewhat. I won't be discussing sculpture today. My colleague Jeffrey Freeman gave an excellent lecture on that subject a few months ago. It's still available on YouTube, and I heartily encourage you to watch it if you haven't done so already. And I should add, all of my colleagues' past lectures given as part of this series are available to watch in the same way. Nor will I be talking about our fascinating period rooms today, the Rouen Room and the Salon Doré. These are worthy of their own separate talk in the future, I feel. Instead, today's talk will focus exclusively on the decorative arts here at the Legion. What I love about the decorative arts is their multifaceted nature. These objects are not just beautiful artworks, examples of human genius and creativity. They also reveal something of the worldview of their creators and owners, how they lived, their social customs, the performative aspects of their culture. They are windows into the past that connect us tangibly to the lives of those who made and used them. It's for these reasons that decorative arts have always played a central role in museums like this one, and at the Legion, they have truly been at the heart of things since its earliest days. So, let's dive right in and see what stories our first object has to tell us. And I'd like to begin with this 17.5-inch high model of Joan of Arc, captured in a moment of prayer, crafted from biscuit Sèvres porcelain, that is, plain white porcelain fired without a glaze. This finish gives it a marble-like appearance, austere and luminous, but it also allows for a remarkable crispness of detail that can, I think, rival any other sculptural medium. The model is based on a terracotta sculpture by Emmanuel Fremier, originally presented to great acclaim at the Paris Salon of 1875. In the center, you can see this sculpture, now at the Petit Palais in Paris, and it's rendered beautifully on your right in an illustration from the Gravure du Monde Illustré of a year later. This piece represents the Legion of Honor's closeness with France from day one, as it formed part of the founding gift presented by the French government at the time of the museum's opening in 1924, including productions of the great State Sèvres porcelain factory of varying kinds, laying the groundwork for our enduring specialism in ceramics here. This is just a snapshot of 18 of the pieces. The total gift numbered 50. The gift was a fascinating and thoughtfully curated mix, part diplomatic gesture, part cultural strategy. It came in 4 distinct categories. Among these were a series of biscuit busts celebrating the historic ties between France and the United States. We can see here, for example, Benjamin Franklin and George Washington, alongside other figures from French history, such as Napoleon and Voltaire. In a similar vein was a collection of biscuit roundels showing figures from history in profile, with a clear emphasis on the Napoleonic period. It also included contemporary ceramics that no doubt aimed to showcase the technical prowess and stylistic range of the Sèvres factory and promote commercial interest in its products in America. And finally, there was a group of pieces not made from luminous white biscuit, but of an unusual stoneware material. During World War I, the Sèvres factory switched to producing ceramic material for the use in the manufacture of firearms. And this is what these pieces are made for. Appropriately enough, the majority of them depict soldiers from that war. This immediately reminds us of the Legion of Honor's founding purpose, aside from its dedication to French culture, to commemorate the First World War, in particular, the 3,600 Californian men who died on the battlefields of France. The museum, of course, officially opened on Armistice Day, November 11th, 1924. In addition to the gift of porcelain, at the same time, 4 tapestries produced by another of the great French state manufactories, the Gobelin, were also presented. 3 of these are currently on view in my colleague Isabella Lores Chavez's excellent exhibition upstairs on the museum's founding in Gallery 1. These too take Joan of Arc as their subject, presenting 4 pivotal moments from the medieval saint's life. This group of objects invites us to consider 2 founding key objectives of the Legion of Honor: the commemoration of the First World War and the celebration and promotion of French culture. Joan of Arc's appearance here in both the tapestries and the porcelain is surely because she is a resonant symbol that occupies an overlap between French national pride and military commemoration. But I wonder if there might be a third layer, something more personal, something connected to the museum's founder, Alma de Bretteville-Spreckels. Alma was, after all, in her own way, something of a warrior. When we turn to the archival records relating to the founding of this institution, the letters, campaigning, fundraising, and logistical management, a portrait of a visionary, consummate, and indefatigable leader emerges. I wonder if Joan of Arc may have also been understood at the time as a subtle recognition of female agency and leadership at a time when such symbols were rare. During the first few decades of the 20th century, there are other examples of this. As you can see here, Joan's image was adopted to marshal women's support of the national effort in the First World War. In the United States and the UK, suffragette marches would often be led by a figure dressed as Joan, as you can also see here. I first became fascinated with this subject when researching a painting in a former job, shown here on your left. It shows the Duchesse d'Uzès working on a monumental sculpture of Joan of Arc. She was the great-granddaughter of Madame Barbe Nicole Clicquot-Ponsardin, the original Veuve Clicquot of Champagne fame, and a sportswoman, author, artist, sculptor, and prominent suffragist. I've paired it with this slightly later painting of Anna Vaughan Hyatt Huntington, working on a maquette of the commanding sculpture of Joan that also appears on our very front lawn here at the Legion. Huntington's original was installed in Manhattan in 1915, also in the context of Franco-American solidarity during World War I. And the cast here at the Legion was personally presented by Huntington and her husband, Archer Milton Huntington, in 1926. Neither of these paintings are in the collection here at the Legion, but I present them to you in support of my argument that Joan of Arc held a certain symbolism in the 1920s that might not be immediately obvious to us today. One of Alma's most notable early allies, Queen Marie of Romania, was another woman who was highly successful in exerting influence via artistic patronage and creativity. She was a painter, poet, and diplomat to designing many pieces of decorative art, including the interiors of her own palaces in Romania, including Pelisor Castle in Sinaia, and the Cotroceni Palace in Bucharest, which we can see here. The portrait of Alma by Richard Hall, painted in 1924, the founding year of the museum, captures the affinity between these two women. Alma is enthroned, quite literally, on the Queen's chair, which she had purchased 2 years prior. Another subtle symbol of power and strength, the chair is now at the Maryhill Museum in Oregon. To what extent the French government were aware of this symbolism in their decisions on what to present to the Legion is perhaps a topic for further archival research. Although I was interested to see that Salvador Dali's signature in Alma's address book, also in the exhibition upstairs, was accompanied by what looks to be the figure of a female warrior on a horse. Is it meant to be Joan of Arc? Well, I think it might be. Our next object is the Fabergé tea service and table, which you can currently see upstairs in Gallery 17. Dating from around the turn of the 20th century, this piece represents the only known example of such a tea service and its matching table surviving together. A parallel example survives only in photos. And we can see here a similar service made for the ballerina Matilda Kaczynska, which the record tells us featured a tabletop made from valuable nephrite. However, what is most compelling about this piece is its provenance. It was presented to the Legion of Honor by a Grand Duchess of Russia, Victoria Melita, the sister of the aforementioned Queen Marie of Romania. Here they are together in a photograph of around 1891. Marie is on your left, Victoria Melita at the center, and their sister Alexandra on the right. They were in fact English by upbringing, being the daughters of the Duke and Duchess of Edinburgh and residing with their parents at Clarence House in London in their youth. We are fortunate to have the letter dated 1922 that accompanies the presentation of the table and tea service, a document that speaks volume, and I'll quote just a portion. Having heard of your wonderful new museum and all you are doing to help my sister, the Queen of Romania, I wish to present you with a golden tea service made by our famous Russian artist Fabergé. It's one of the few treasures saved, and I'm glad if it can find a place in the glorious monument you are building to the memory of your California soldiers. The Grand Duchess and her husband, Grand Duke Kirill, were among the few Romanovs who managed to flee to Finland and thus survive the bloody Russian Revolution of 1917. The donation of the tea service and table remains a powerful act of generosity and a reminder of why the Legion of Honor was such a compelling idea in 1924, a place where diplomacy, commemoration, and art converged. On the other hand, it may have also had a political aspect, and it's perhaps not a coincidence that Victoria Melita would embark on a speaking tour of the United States in 1924 in order to campaign for the reinstatement of the monarchy in Russia with her husband as Tsar. Here are the service's marks. At the top is the iconic Fabergé stamp in Cyrillic, and below, at the bottom, is the Moscow quality head hallmark dating between 1899 and 1908. We also find it stamped with the mark of Julius Rappaport. These figures here, the IP is in Cyrillic. Julius Rappaport, one of the Fabergé's 4 leading workmasters who was active between 1886 and 1908. Rappaport, based in St. Petersburg, which was a superior Fabergé workshop thanks to its proximity to the royal court, specialized in silverwork of the highest caliber, crystal frames, jardinières, intricate silverware, and lamps. He seems to have been something of a stylistic chameleon, effortlessly mastering the full range of styles from Rococo to Empire, Art Nouveau to traditional Russian. And you can see that mastery on display here. The service is a remarkable synthesis of French Empire-style formality and Art Nouveau fluidity. Its iconographical theme is clear. Both the paired swan and the writhing serpents are traditional symbols of enduring love. This beautiful commode by the cabinet maker Martin Carlin is one of the finest pieces of furniture in the museum today, and part of another crucially important early donation, the Collis Potter Huntington collection, which arrived at the museum in 1927. This gift of over 500 artworks included around 150 pieces of European decorative art and sculpture, with highlights such as mounted porcelain, which we'll see in a minute, as well as tapestries and furniture like this, cementing the Legion's position as one of the most important centers for European decorative arts in the United States beyond the East Coast. Collis Potter Huntington was one of the famed Big Four railroad tycoons whose influence helped shape not only the American transportation network, but its philanthropic landscape. But although the bequest was named for him, in reality, once again, we have a female collector to thank for it, his widow, Arabella Huntington. And we can see here a typically spectacular interior from her New York residence on Fifth Avenue from around the 1890s. It's highly likely that the commode corresponds to a piece of furniture supplied by the Parisian dealer-decorator Simon Poirier to the mistress of Louis XV, Madame de Barry. He recorded on the 16th of May, 1773, and I've translated this from the French, a superb commode of ancient lacquer of the greatest quality, the central panel with richly attired figures with friezes in ebony, finely chased ormolu mounts, and a statuary white marble top. It was destined for du Barry's corner cabinet in her apartments at the Château of Versailles, which have in fact recently been renovated in recent years. This is the room, perhaps it was to go on this pier between the two windows on your left. Madame du Barry met a tragic end at the guillotine during the French Revolution, and her art collection was confiscated. The commode is next recorded at the English stately home Uppark House in Sussex, owned by Sir Harry Fanshawe, a close associate of the future King George IV. Although we don't know the exact details of how it got there, we do know that Fanshawe frequented a Parisian dealer called Martin Illois l'Ignoreur, who also worked for George IV, swelling the royal collection with vast quantities of very comparable objects that had also been confiscated from their previous owners during the French Revolution. After suffering a decline in fortunes, the Fanshawe family were required to sell much of Uppark's contents in 1910, which was acquired by Partridge & Sons of Bond Street, London, in 1911 for £38,000. Partridge, who was fearful of tariffs, took the decision to ship the collection to New York immediately aboard the Lusitania and exhibited the collection at the state apartments of the Plaza Hotel there. It was here that Arabella reportedly saw the collection and wrote a check for a six-figure sum. Thus, we have the taste of the kind of journey that many of the Huntington pieces have been on to get to us today at the Legion. Among the many treasures Arabella collected through high-profile purchases in Paris and London were several mounted porcelain vases, which were bequeathed to the Legion as well. Many of these came from Joseph Devine, who obtained them from the Rodolphe Kahn collection in 1907, one of the great treasure troves of decorative arts in pre-World War I Paris. One particularly notable example is this Celadon crackleware vase, mounted in a rich Rococo bronze setting. The porcelain emulates the so-called famous Southern co-craquelure, sometimes referred to charmingly in French inventories as porcelaine truitée for its resemblance to trout scales. Here, the gilt bronze mounts are attributed to Claude Duplessis, one of the most celebrated ciseleurs d'horreur of mid-18th century France. The mounts bear this, the so-called crown C mark, a tax stamp used between 1745 and 49, enabling us to date the piece with some accuracy. We suspect the lid may have actually been a separate piece entirely, a separate tea bowl, a detail that opens up conversations about the creative repurposing often carried out by a specific kind of dealer and interior decorator operating in 18th century France called the marchand mercier, who were usually responsible for such creations. They would often take porcelain pieces that had been imported from the Far East and adapt them, cutting and adding gilt bronze elements and bringing disparate pieces together. Some other collections have worked on removing the mounts from their porcelain pieces, which enable us to see how they were constructed. For example, these two pieces from the Royal Collection, and note how the ginger jar on your left has been cut twice to enable the insertion of the gilt bronze mounts. And maybe that's something that we could do here someday. After Arabella's death in 1924, it was her son, Archer Milton Huntington, who donated the collection to the Legion, apparently in accordance with his mother's wishes. This tradition of, and style of art collecting, heavily colored by an obsession with pre-revolutionary France, endured throughout the 19th century, from George IV in Britain to the Rothschilds, and ending up with the leading Gilded Age collectors of America, such as Arabella Huntington. We are most fortunate to house a spectacular collection of this kind within our holdings here at the Legion of Honor. One of the most imposing and celebrated works in our collection is our ebony cabinet by Pierre Gaulle, which was a gift from the legendary newspaper magnate William Randolph Hearst in 1947. Its maker, Pierre Gaulle, is probably not a household name, yet he was one of the most important cabinet makers working in France in the reign of Louis XIV. Born in Holland, Gaulle came to the French court in the 1650s and began to work immediately for Cardinal Mazarin, effective ruler of France in the early years of Louis XIV's reign. There's a group of these cabinets located in collections around the world. For example, here's one at Windsor Castle and another one at the Rijksmuseum. We might pause here to consider the architectural quality of these cabinets. Built at an impressive scale on ornately decorated legs, and decorated with scenes from the Old Testament, they were designed to house and display the most valued and mysterious art objects in their owners' collections, a kind of universal microcosm all of their own. Cabinet makers in France would always be known as ébénistes because of these monumental cabinets, veneered in lustrous ébène or ebony. Hearst acquired the cabinet from the antiquarian dealers C&E Canessa in 1924, and here you can see it in their catalogue of that year. What's most fascinating here is the note at your bottom right, which tells us that it was in the collection of Adolphe de Rothschild. And the cabinet is in fact depicted in a painting of a salon in Adolphe de Rothschild's home in Paris in 1876 by Eugène Lamy. As we can see from this painting, Adolphe was a keen collector of antiquarian objects, many of which have ended up in museums, collections around the world. The exterior panels depict a gallery of Old Testament monarchs and heroes, all rendered in low-relief ebony. Examining the sources for the iconographical decoration is fun and provides a fascinating insight into the visual culture of mid-17th century France, although I've decided to just focus on 3 sections today. The front door on your left shows the story of Jephthah. In the Old Testament, Jephthah was noted for vowing to God that in return for a military victory, he would sacrifice whatever or whoever came out of the door of his home first. Tragically for him, it was his eldest daughter, and that's the scene you can see here. You can see his daughter coming out the house here, and then Jephthah fainting in horror. This particular composition is after one devised by artist Simon Vuet as part of the series of tapestries commissioned by Louis XIII, and here is the design shown in a slightly later engraving. If I reverse it, the similarity is even more striking, and I'd already assumed that the composition had been adapted to go onto the cabinet, but actually it's really quite close. And just for fun, here is the extraordinary tapestry woven according to Vouet's designs on the same subject, which is now in the Chateau of Versailles. I have to say, in my opinion, Jeps's reaction and his facial expression especially seems most compelling in its carved incarnation on our cabinet. On the opposite door, we see the Queen of Sheba visiting Solomon with her caravan of valuable gifts and gold. Interestingly, this seems to be formed of a combination of engraved sources. This figure of a man doubled over carrying a large pot of coins seems to be based on an engraving after Raphael's rendering of the subject in his decorations of the Vatican, whereas the figure of the centurion stood in the corner appears to be related to a different rendering by Martin van Heemskerk. And it's really fascinating how these have been combined. If we open the cabinet, we're confronted with a further layer of drawers and a central panel, each surface again decorated with intricate figurative carving. And if we open the central panel, the heart of the cabinet is revealed, a vignette of gilt figures depicting the judgment of Solomon on a kind of stage set. It is quite a concerning scene. It shows how Solomon resolved a dispute between two women claiming to be the mother of the same child. He proposes to divide the living child in half, with each woman receiving a portion. The true mother, demonstrating her love and selflessness, pleads for the child's life to be spared, even if it means giving the child to the other woman. Solomon then declares her the true mother. A rather heavy-handed approach, perhaps, but it was a popular subject in the mid-17th century and mid-17th century France as an example of shrewd government and wise judgment. Interestingly, a very similar arrangement can be found in the interior of the Rijksmuseum, here, which you can see at the top right. The iconography appears to draw heavily from Matthias Merian's Icones Biblicae and was used in a number of paintings of the era, notably by Valentin de Boulogne and Nicolas Poussin, as seen here. The iconographical program, with themes of biblical heroism and wise government, does seem to point towards royal ownership, but the lack of documentation from the era makes a firm attribution to a particular owner difficult. In 1987, the then director of the Fine Arts Museums, Harry Parker, decided all early modern European art should be moved to the Legion. No longer would the museum be exclusively French. It meant, however, for the first time, that English pieces such as this arrived here. The Strawberry Hill Commode by Pierre Langlois, made for Horace Walpole and on display upstairs in Gallery 13. This was donated to the Fine Arts Museums by Mrs. Lurleen Matson-Roth of Filoli, just south of San Francisco, 2 years earlier in 1985, and here you can see it in its previous home on the right-hand side. Walpole was a collector of paintings, antiquities, books, furniture, and decorative arts, and through his incisive letters and writings was both a commentator and tastemaker of mid-Georgian England. He is synonymous with his Gothic masterpiece, Home, Strawberry Hill in Twickenham on the western outskirts of London, which he extended and embellished over a number of decades and where our commode was first located. He provided his own lacquer panels for the piece and noted in his diaries, "The 2 commodes and 4 coins cost £125 without the Japan, which was my own, but the bending it into the present forms by Langlois, a Frenchman, was very expensive." This quote's quite helpful because it really speaks to the process involved in making this piece. The commode is veneered in lacquer panels supplied by Walpole himself to the cabinet maker, which would have almost certainly come from a large lacquer screen imported from China. These panels would need to be carefully sanded down to such a thinness that they could be adhered to the undulating shape of this Rococo commode, much harder to achieve than, in this case, than, for example, on the Carlton one we looked at earlier. As Walpole tells us, this job was executed by Pierre Langlois, one of the leading cabinet makers of the period working in London, and he specialized in cabinets of this kind. And you can see his trade card, which really has the look of one of his pieces of furniture. Obviously, it was consummately achieved, as the commode remains in beautiful condition. It, along with its partner, was located in one of the period's most influential interiors, the gallery at Strawberry Hill. The space was meant to resemble an Elizabethan long gallery and vaulted in plaster and papier-mâché in the late Perpendicular style, modelled after Henry VII's chapel at Westminster Abbey. The 2 commodes were located in the windows, and if we look at this illustration, we can see them here. And the great thing about this very high-resolution image from the V&A is that we can zoom right in and see them quite clearly. To Walpole, it made perfect sense to mix the contemporary Rococo Langlois commodes with the Gothic rival interior. It simply added to the sense of layers of history being conveyed by the objects. The great thing about Strawberry Hill and the Walpole collection was how well it was documented. For example, in this publication, a description of the villa of Mr. Horace Walpole of 1784. The book contains full description of our commode and its pair, including description of the objects that adorned them that match perfectly with the illustrations. The description reads, 2 commodes of old Japan with marble slabs. On one, a vase, boat-shaped, of deep blue Sèvres china, mounted in ormolu with snake handles. 2 large vases, ditto, of Roman faience, finely painted and inscribed, Fate in bottega de Orazio Fontana. One on the other commode, another like the former, and 2 bottles of blue and white and gold Sèvres china, most beautifully ornamented. And as you can see, all of these objects are identifiable and now reside in the British Museum, the Victoria and Albert Museum, and the Wallace Collection. You'll have noticed it mentions everywhere that our commode was one of a pair. And you may well ask, where is the other one? Well, it's here in the Museo Nacional del Arte Decorativo in Buenos Aires. And I think we definitely need to go and visit it one day. I've become slightly obsessed with this object, which you can view next door in the porcelain gallery for a number of reasons. It is, of course, a potpourri vase shaped like a dovecote. Given to the museum as part of the spectacular Bowles collection of 18th-century English and French porcelain in 1986, it is a wonderful ceramic fantasy that has a pronounced Disney-esque sensibility. Constance Bowles Peabody tells us she decided to buy it in 1973 at Christie's in London because of the hunting theme, the fox and doves, and the whimsy of the piece and its bucolic strength. Burning pastils of incense could be placed under the little roofs, as well as potpourri in the main chamber. I mean, you can only imagine what it would look like with smoke spiraling from its turrets. A specific mention in the 1755 sale of Chelsea porcelain held by Mr. Ford in his great room at the Haymarket, London, may be referring to this piece, mentioning, and I quote, a most beautiful perfume pot in the form of a pigeon house, with pigeons, a fox, etc. It seems to have been one of the largest things ever produced at the Chelsea factory, and was very probably specifically aimed at competing with German Meissen, who, of course, used hard-paste porcelain, which would always be much easier to use for large-scale works. There are only a few other known examples. The one on your left was sold a few years back at Sotheby's. The one at the center is at the Met in New York. And examples were produced by other factories, such as the one on your right by Derby. However, the Legion's is objectively the best one. I think it encompasses the obsession with picturesque ruins that dominated during the first half of the 18th century. You don't need to look very much further in our porcelain gallery to find other pieces that depict a similar subject. Picturesque buildings in charming landscapes abound. I love the idea that this piece depicts the same, in 3 dimensions, the same decoration shown in 2 on other pieces of the same era. And this even goes for the cheeky fox, who has a 2D lookalike on this contemporaneous saucer depicting one of Aesop's fables. The artist who worked on these pieces may have been referring to these kinds of drawing books. This particular example was executed by Jean-Baptiste Pimont for a new drawing book of landscapes published in 1755. François Boucher has often been cited as an influence for this style of decoration, but Pimont is probably more compelling in this case, as he spent so much time in England. Pimont also operated as a painter in oils, and again, we don't need to go so far to see an especially beautiful example of this, Gallery 7 upstairs, in fact. The interplay between fine artists such as Pimont, Boucher, and Jean-Baptiste Udry and the design of decorative arts, especially in the early to mid-18th century, is a truly fascinating subject which we might be well placed to explore further at the Legion in the future. I especially love these 3 objects, which were all acquired over the last 5 years by my predecessor as curator in charge, Martin Chapman. We have on your left the Lansdowne vase, in the center what has become known as the Beckford bowl, and on the right, the Hope vase. And I should add that these are quite out of scale. The Beckford bowl is much smaller than the other 2. This trio is especially illustrative because they represent 3 collectors who were around at the same kind of time, but had rather different approaches and tastes. And here are those collectors, all hinted at by the monikers we have given to the objects. And perhaps it makes sense to look at the slightly older one in detail first. The Lansdowne vase. The Lansdowne in the name here refers to William Petty Fitzmaurice, the first Marquess of Lansdowne, who was better known as the Earl of Shelburne between 1761 and 1784. The vase is a creation of one of the most influential artists of the late 18th century in Europe, Giovanni Battista Piranesi. Artist, architect, and archaeologist, he ran a thriving business in Rome, restoring and selling ancient marble sculpture, but was most famous as a printmaker. And I include here this wonderful watercolor etching, which is on display just across the corridor in my colleague Natalia Loricella's exhibition in the Achenbach Gallery. It sums up this moment so well, not just because it is by Piranesi, but because it shows these high-class tourists digging around among the ruins of Pompeii. Fascinatingly, the Lansdowne vase is partially unique and partially antique. Piranesi augmented the ancient Roman marble fragment of the lid and shoulder by recreating the body of the vase with strigliated spiral fluting inspired by ornament on ancient sarcophagi. It was included as a plate in Piranesi's engraved series, Vasi, Candelabri, Cipi, Sarcophagi, Tripodi, Lucerni ed Ornamenti Antichi, first published in Rome in 1778, showing this to be a design in which the artist clearly held much pride. It was acquired in Rome by the Irish painter Hugh Primrose Dean and was added to the legendary collection of ancient classical sculpture belonging to Lord Shelburne, which he housed at his London home, Lansdowne House. Shelburne's always greatly interested me, especially because of his patronage of French architects who he attracted to come and work for him in London. For example, designs for Shelburne's gallery at Lansdowne House were supplied by both Charles-Louis Clerisot and François-Joseph Bélanger, and this is the design you can see here, quite a spectacular interior. The gallery was in the end subject to a rather more conventional design by the English architect Robert Smirke, but would be used to display the Lansdowne sculpture collection, which now fills many museums worldwide. For example, this stunning chair, known as the Lansdowne Throne of Apollo, is now down at Lackner, presented to them incidentally by William Randolph Hearst. Returning to our trio of objects, what really fascinates me is how these can highlight a slight generational difference between Shelburne and the other two. Although it's only 20 years, it makes all the difference. Shelburne, for me, represents a slightly earlier phase, a quite academic and focused obsession with neoclassicism, something more of the age of the Enlightenment. However, the other two were still quite young when that world-shifting event, the French Revolution, came along, perhaps heralding, or at least signaling, a shift to a more personal, idiosyncratic and eclectic worldview, what is often termed Romanticism. Although having said that, Beckford and Hope reflect this shift in quite different ways. So now to focus on the Beckford Bowl. William Beckford was born into great wealth. His father, a liberal politician known as Alderman Beckford, derived his wealth from sugar plantations in Jamaica, which were worked on by enslaved Africans. First, all of his activities were entirely financed by the dreadful Atlantic slave trade, a reality that we must always consider when dealing with his objects. Beckford was gay, at a time when, of course, it was not acceptable, and thus was tainted with scandal that never went away, causing him to move around Europe when he was younger, and then live as a recluse when older, adding yet further to his mysterious reputation. This bowl, made of Chinese porcelain and decorated with green dahlias on a black ground, was mounted in silver gilt in London in 1811, when Beckford was 51. By having it mounted in expensive silver gilt, he elevated this rare piece of Chinese porcelain yet further. Its interior is engraved with his coat of arms, surrounded by 16th-century style ornament, and a repeating pattern of martlets, the tiny birds from his coat of arms, flock across its inside in a regular, repeating pattern. The porcelain itself was already rare, not least because of its unusual decoration of green dahlias on a black ground, known as famille noire, greatly in demand by European collectors. And actually, if we turn it over, we can see the blue and white marks underneath of a kind that were used on porcelain that was exported from China to other countries in Southeast Asia, rather than to Europe. Beckford's country seat, the neo-Gothic Fonthill Abbey, was probably his most famous creation. By 1813, it was the size of a cathedral, with a tower reaching 276 feet high. However, it's perhaps even more famous for collapsing in 1825, just after Beckford had managed to sell it. The building has obtained a legendary status. It's often considered to have been a major influence on the Palace of Westminster, the seat of the British Parliament. But Beckford was also one of the most important and pioneering art collectors of his age, championing interest in old master paintings, as well as in a dizzying array of different types of decorative art. Our bowl speaks to this interest in objets de luxe, and would be most at home in this triptych of paintings commissioned by Beckford not long before his death from the artist Willis Maddox, which are kind of melancholy portraits of his art collection. The bowl has a great provenance, apparently having been in the collection of the poet Edward James, known for his patronage of leading surrealist artists in the mid-century, and the London dealer and style maker Christopher Gibbs, who was, I've been told, the first man in 1960s London to wear flared trousers. Our final piece in this trio of new objects is the Thomas Hope vase. The collector, connoisseur, writer, and designer Thomas Hope was a member of the Hope banking dynasty and a leading and influential patron of the arts in London in the opening years of the 19th century. And this is the best portrait of him. It shows him in Turkish dress, painted shortly after his return from Turkey, Greece, Syria, and Egypt in the years 1796 and 97. Hope settled in London in 1799 in a house on Duchess Street, which had been built by Robert Adam in the 1770s. And worked on it for some years to transform it into a kind of showpiece for his style and beliefs. Incorporated into his work was inspiration from classical antiquity, but now also with Egyptian and Ottoman influences, and with some of the glitz of the Napoleonic French Empire style, which was happening around the same kind of time. Interior views of his house on Duchess Street, such as this one showing the Egyptian room, were published in his seminal book, Household Furniture and Interior Decoration of 1807. It also included clear illustrations of furniture and decorative objects Hope had designed, including our vase. The vase, in fact, has 4 pages devoted to it in the book. It's not known exactly where it was shown at Duchess Street. It doesn't appear in any of the interior views, but its theming around Bacchus perhaps suggests it was in the dining room, which wasn't featured in the book. Rather than having it cast of bronze, amazingly it's made of copper, beaten in a technique more associated with the production of silver, and then patinated to resemble bronze. Hope claimed in Household Furniture that his design was based on a vase of white marble he had seen in the museum at Portici, Italy. However, he may have also had one eye on this vase, known as the Sosibius vase, dating from around 50 BC, originally in the collection of Louis XIV and now in the Louvre. The distinctive handles, especially the swans, are quite unmistakable. And incidentally, this vase was sketched by the Romantic poet John Keats, and is sometimes discussed as a possible inspiration for his poem, Ode on a Grecian Urn. Hope's obsession with vases is clear to see in this photograph of the vase room at his country house, the Dietding. Taken later in the 19th century, he was the purchaser of the famous collection of ancient vases previously owned by Sir William Hamilton, which forms much of what you can see in this photograph, and which can today be found in museums across the world. There were always thought to be at least 2 of these vases, however, only one was recognized for many years, having been in the collection of the V&A since 1983. The one here at the Legion was rediscovered in Oklahoma in 2023. How wonderful that the second vase has come out of hiding and is now here with us at the Legion. Thus, 3 exciting objects that I think can tell us so much about their respective collectors and the different motivations that drove them in the late 18th and early 19th century. We hope they'll be appearing in the galleries in the coming months. And finally, we arrive at this piece which brings us nearly up to date. Acquired just last year, thanks to an impressive coalition of generosity, the Gwyn & Gibbons Adrian panel is another exciting recent acquisition for our department. This carved wooden panel, only the third Gibbons work in a US museum collection, captures the full theatricality of Baroque England. Gibbons is Britain's most celebrated woodcarver. His lively sculptural language transformed the interiors of many of the nation's greatest palaces, churches, and institutions during the later decades of the 17th century. This portrait of him by Sir Godfrey Kneller, now in the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg, shows him holding a marble bust and a pair of calipers, reminding us, probably quite deliberately, that he was also a sculptor in stone and marble. Work on our panel is ongoing. We are still unclear about which of Gibbons' projects it came from. However, it bears significant resemblance to his work at Petworth House in Sussex, especially in the area known as the Carved Room, named after his decorations which surround the paintings there. The previously mentioned Horace Walpole visited Petworth in 1749 and lauded there, and I quote, "the finest carving of Gibbons that ever my eyes beheld." It was published twice in the early 20th century, once in Herbert Krzezinski's English Furniture of the 18th Century, and again 27 years later in a 1936 article in The Connoisseur. And you may have noticed this, both photos are captioned with "formerly in the collection of Mr. Robert Christie, Esquire." This Mr. Christie was, by 1861, recorded as living in Marylebone, London, working as a cabinet maker. In August 1880, the French Gazette announced that he was one of the 3 London firms commissioned to supply the furniture for the new palatial yacht built for the Emperor of Russia, and was given particular responsibility for the construction and decoration of the interior of the Great State Saloon. The greatest insight into Christie and his activities is from this article from the Cabinet Maker and Art Furnisher of 1883, which runs into several pages. But I became particularly interested in this passage, which describes, and I quote, "A love of good carving is Mr. Christie's paramount weakness." It describes how, in Christie's opinion, it was difficult to obtain carving of an appropriate standard in England at the time, and that he often had to source such material from Japan or Italy. Although frustratingly there is no mention of our Gibbons panel, this information does fit the profile of someone who would have greatly prized such a piece and may have even kept it as inspiration for his own workshop. The article also includes some fascinating illustrations of his interiors. For example, this one on the Russian Emperor's yacht, which looks to feature what may indeed be highly elaborate carving. Christie worked with a number of English arts and crafts era architects, including Ernest Gibson, Ernest Newton, and especially Richard Norman Shaw, who regularly employed him from the 1880s and even took his son Archie on as an apprentice. That the panel was owned by a figure such as Christie, who was working for these leading architects, places it right at the center of what is often referred to as the late 19th century Gibbons revival. The panel's subsequent acquisition by the Hollywood fashion designer Gilbert Adrian, more often simply known as Adrian, also presents a fascinating chapter, and this, of course, is where it gets its title as the Adrian panel. Adrian is probably most famous for designing the costumes for The Wizard of Oz, including its iconic ruby slippers, but also worked on innumerable other films, including several costume dramas such as Pride and Prejudice of 1940 and Marie Antoinette of 1938, where an antiquarian sensibility is, I think, much in evidence. How an appreciation for the past and the objects associated with it trickled down via the silver screen in the mid-20th century is of great interest to me. I hope we'll eventually get to the bottom of where the panel originally came from, but from its 17th century origins through to the 19th century Gibbons revival and eventual appearance in Hollywood, it is an object that illuminates at least three fascinating moments for us. And I'd like to end with this rather lovely painting of Adrian's living room in Hollywood by Jeremiah Goodman from the mid-century, with the Gibbons panel delicately rendered at the center, a reminder of this great object's journey through the ages to get to us here at the Legion. It will, I hope, be on show within a year, so keep an eye out for it. So to finish, thank you so much for being here today and for coming along on this journey through the history of the Legion of Honor's extraordinary European decorative arts collections. I hope you can see now why I love these objects so much, not just for their beauty, but for the stories they can tell, the craftsmanship they embody, and the connections they make possible across time and space. But we're barely scratching the surface. There are so many more works to look at and secrets to unlock, and I can't wait to see what else lies ahead in the coming years. Before we finish, I wanted to again express my deep gratitude to my colleagues here at the Legion of Honor. Their support in these early weeks has been invaluable, and their welcome has meant the world. And finally, to the extraordinary curators, collectors, supporters, and donors, past and present, whose generosity and vision has built and maintained this collection, thank you for this legacy. And thank you all for coming today. People of San Francisco, these wonderful objects belong to you. Thank you. I think we might have 5 to 10 minutes for some questions if anyone has any. Yeah, if you'd like to raise your hand if you have a question, we have some microphones.
What does our museum need more of in the decorative arts?
I think, well, it's going to be an interesting project to kind of get to grips with the entire collection and sort of work out what would be best to acquire next. I feel like it's already so strong, but you know, there was in recent decades, there was already some incredible acquisitions, and I'd really like to keep that momentum going. So we're going to see, I think, in the coming years. Yeah, but I'm still kind of getting to grips with the collection, and so it's been 10 weeks. So I'm trying to maybe ask me that in a kind of in a 6 months' time, and I'll be able to give you a better answer, I'm afraid. Thank you.
Since you've only been here a month, is there anything that you've discovered that was surprising to you?
Oh, well, everything that I've tried, that I discovered that I thought was surprising, I've tried to include in this lecture. So.
Okay, okay.
Thank you. That was wonderful. Where are the other two Gibbings panels in America?
So they're in Cleveland and Chicago.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This was a really great talk. I'm curious how you feel the holdings in the Legion of Honor fit with your PhD dissertation.
Oh, thank you. Well, I mean, so I'm working on the links between 18th century Britain and France, particularly just in the lead up to the French Revolution. And I mentioned earlier that it would be great to do a talk about the Salon Doré, because that's very much the kind of era that I'm focusing on. But also the architecture of the museum is another subject that I'd like to do a separate talk on in the future. And that because that's based on the Hôtel de Sam in Paris, which is, of course, an iconic architectural project of that era. So there's lots to there's lots of kind of options for bringing in that period of the 1780s, and I hope to do that again in a future talk. Yeah.
Hi, great talk.
Thank you.
You mentioned in passing the English or the British Baroque, and I tend to think of the Baroque as Counter-Reformation, continental, and I don't know much about it in Britain. So can you tease out that a little bit?
Yeah, I think English Baroque was a slightly more pared down equivalent to what was happening on the continent. But of course, after the restoration of Charles II in the 1660s, people felt much more liberated to kind of go a bit more crazy with interior decoration, I think. And we have architects like James Gibbs and Thomas Archer producing all the wonderful churches in London. Christopher Wren, of course. That whole era, it's incredibly rich, and I'm so glad that we have this piece of this example of work from that era here at the collection, in the collections now. Yeah.
Hello. What type of objects would you considering for a collection for the museum from this century?
Oh, from this century?
From this century.
Oh, that's interesting. Well, yeah, we would really like to develop our 20th century holdings, I think. So do you mean like contemporary, like now, or kind of in the past 100 years? This is primarily, I think we would like to develop our modern collections, and we are already kind of acquiring acquisitions of 20th century pieces. So we're thinking about how to deploy those in the future. Yeah. Okay, I think is that it? There's no more questions? All right, thank you.